single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making it another stand.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Chantal Destra. For years, environmental advocates and lawmakers have been pushing for a bill known as the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act. If enacted, the legislation would require companies to reduce their plastic waste by creating an official recycling plan for their packaging materials. Supporters of the legislation say that it's time for the state to take serious action to reduce plastic waste. Meanwhile, critics argue that the policy could unintentionally result in price increases that would be passed on to consumers. In this next segment, our Elise Klein brings us a deep dive on where things stand at the state capitol for the legislation. Here's that story.
At a time when New York is reaching limits to handling plastic waste, some state lawmakers and environmental advocates have renewed their push to pass a bill called the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act. The legislation, nicknamed the PREA bill, aims to reduce plastic waste by creating a packaging and single-use plastics extended producer responsibility program, which would essentially require companies to reduce their plastic waste. Currently in the state, plastic waste is eliminated through a variety of processes, including recycling, landfills, and incinerators. The problem is, landfills have a limited lifespan, and increasing plastic waste threatens capacity. Two major landfills in New York, one in Suffolk County and one in Ontario County, are scheduled to close in 2028. Some environmental advocates say consumers and municipalities shouldn't have to bear the brunt of the plastic waste issue.
So in the face of these landfills that are being shut down, we have to get at the source. And ultimately, it needs to be the producers of all this plastic waste that are responsible for that waste.
At a recent press conference, legislative sponsors of the bill stressed this is an issue supported by the public.
People understand because they are receiving all of this trash that they then have to either pay a hauler to take away or are paying through their taxes to have their municipality get rid of it.
According to a 2025 Siena poll, 73% of New Yorkers think big companies should be required to reduce packaging on their products. Many environmental advocates say simply they want less waste and lower taxes, and this bill is the best way to do just that. Randall Sorcerer, a volunteer with the Beyond Plastics campaign, has traveled to the Capitol many times over the past few years advocating for this bill, taking a bus all the way from his home in Nassau County.
Because our landfills are slated to close within the next year. We incinerate our waste on Long Island, where I live. The toxic ash goes out to Brookhaven landfill, which is slated to close. So we're going to have to transport all that waste and toxic ash to upstate New York, to out of state. And the further you transport your waste, the more tax dollars get spent on it. So we want less waste, which will result in lower taxes.
Other advocates like Judith Enck, president of Beyond Plastics and former regional administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, say this legislation will significantly improve the state's ability to reduce plastic waste.
We all grew up hearing the sing-song phrase, reduce, reuse, recycle, but in fact, we do very little on reduction and reuse, and this bill changes that. This bill will require a 30% reduction in single-use plastic packaging over 12 years. We'll get the worst toxic chemicals out of packaging and put a modest fee on packaging so taxpayers get some relief.
A 2025 needs assessment study from the Center for Sustainable Materials Management reports that a significant portion of plastic materials are not accepted in recycling programs. The study shows a range of 60% and below acceptance to about 75% and above acceptance of plastic materials such as bulky plastics, plastic jugs, and plastic bags. Many lawmakers share advocates' passion for this bill, hoping to see it passed in both houses this year.
So much of our plastic goes into the ocean and really has an impact on wildlife, has an impact on our entire ecosystem. But also it's frustrating for most of us when we get packages at home and we have to get some tiny little thing like a battery in a giant package. We don't need that much packaging to get our materials, and we can see that we don't because there are many companies that have already made changes.
But it really is dire that we start looking at policy and a supporting policy that would remove these toxic materials from our everyday lives.
While many lawmakers want to get the PREA bill passed into law, the bill faces many challenges. For several years, the bill has passed the Senate and been on the Assembly floor calendar for a vote, but never proceeded to the floor. The Assembly Speaker says the votes simply weren't there. Glick says while she thought they were close to having the votes needed to pass the bill in the Assembly in prior years, some members got nervous at the end.
I know that some members will not want to be totally honest with the sponsor that they have concerns. They're a little hesitant. They don't want to get into a long discussion. So they say they're supportive, but then they go to the speaker and say, well, I do have some concerns, because they feel they can be more open with the speaker. So I think that's what happened last year.
Lawmakers who don't support the bill say they are worried about costs to the state and feasibility.
If you're going to pass a policy that has the potential to spike food prices further, which is what a lot of us are concerned that something like EPR would do, because of having to change, packaging materials and all that type of stuff, that's a huge concern. People are hurting right now, and we need to find ways to reduce their costs, not adopt a policy that would increase them.
Environmental bills, they're well-intended, but there's an economic cost to all of these.
The bill also has a large lobby against it from varying business and industry groups. Ken Polkowski from the Business Council of New York State says this bill will impose costs and disruptions for both consumers and business.
Simply put, it's a bad bill. As I said, it's an outlier. It's very different from what other states have done. It really focuses on material bans. We think it has very unworkable source reduction mandates.
Patrick Krieger with the Plastics Industry Association, a lobby group against the bill, says while they support enhanced producer responsibility or EPR legislation in other states, like Minnesota, Washington, and Maryland, they have concerns with New York's version.
Unfortunately, this bill is not well crafted, and what it will result is in something that's more expensive for New Yorkers and have worse environmental outcomes.
Glick pushes back on lobbyists' argument that this bill would increase costs for consumers, saying it is largely debunked, highlighting prior studies on other jurisdictions' EPR policies similar to her bill, such as Canada's bill. According to a 2020 study from Resource Recycling Systems, data showed no correlation between enhanced producer responsibility and packaging and printed paper policies and product prices. Another 2022 study from Columbia University showed similar results, concluding even if compliance with EPR policies leads to doubling packaging costs, the impact on grocery spending is very small, averaging to below 1%. Glick adds industry stakeholders simply expressing concerns about costs, however, makes members nervous.
The big concern is this going to cost people more? And all industry has to say is, if we have to make these changes, it's going to cost more. And, that's all they have to do in this environment, even if there is no data to suggest that's true.
Glick argues this bill would actually improve affordability because the cost and responsibility would fall to big plastic producers, who across the United States generate hundreds of billions of dollars in gross output.
In fact, the public is paying for all of the cost of disposal, all of the costs, even though they have no control over how much waste is sent to them at home. So whether they're paying it in their taxes or if they have to pay to have it picked up by a private hauler, or whether they are paying a fee at their dump.
According to the New York City Department of Sanitation, New York City alone paid around $500 million last year in waste management via local tax revenue. Glick says while they want to keep important pieces of the bill, such as producer responsibility plastic reduction, they have made changes to the bill about timelines, aiming to give producers more time to adjust to the new mandates if the bill passes. But some of the naysaying lobby groups seem to have eyes on another competing bill, the Affordable Waste Reduction Act. This bill is modeled after enhancer producer legislation adopted in Minnesota and would establish a program to increase recycling and source reduction, as well as aim to minimize costs for consumers and producers.
And it really focuses on making recycling work better, diverting more material from disposal back into productive reuse. And we think that's the way to go. We think that's doable. We think that's affordable. And we think it meets what the state, says it wants.
Krieger says this bill would also establish consistency for consumers because it is modeled after another state bill on this issue.
We think that that's much more reasonable. It has a really thoughtful understanding about how good EPR needs to be designed.
Some environmental advocates argue, however, the Affordable Waste Reduction Bill was written with strong business interest in mind and doesn't go far enough to reduce health and environmental concerns associated with increased plastic waste.
all it does is put a fee on packaging with money going to local governments to support recycling. That's a good thing, but it's not going to solve the plastic pollution problem because plastic recycling doesn't work. People should keep recycling other material, but plastic recycling clocks in at only 5 to 6%. So giving more money for plastic recycling doesn't get microplastics out of our bodies, doesn't get it out of our rivers, doesn't address the serious climate and health issues associated with plastic.
Lobbyist arguments for and against the two bills are consistent in the legislative chambers. Legislative sponsors of the Affordable Waste Reduction Act say this version is more comprehensive and prioritizes affordability compared to the PREA bill.
Well, it's more of a focus more on recycling instead of banning. It's also promoting union jobs. It is ensuring that our consumers are not the ones who are footing the bill.
If we had the bill that you mentioned as is, then that would keep a lot of products off the shelf, and that impacts my district because they care about the affordability. Because prices will go up, some things will come off the shelf that they can't eat or utilize, and so that's why I created an alternative.
Lawmakers who support this bill, like State Senator D. Murray, a Republican representing parts of Suffolk County, and the only Republican co-sponsor of the bill, says he thinks this bill is a smarter approach.
I think it's a more business-friendly approach. It puts the onus more on the producers to be smarter with their packaging. They understand that the other bill is a reduction. It is an elimination bill. It's taking away, and it's basically punishing consumers and businesses. This doesn't do that.
Meanwhile, state lawmakers like State Senator Rachel May, a Democrat representing parts of Syracuse who has voted for the PREA bill, says the Affordable Waste Reduction Act focuses on the process of recycling plastic, which can be done either through mechanical recycling methods or chemical recycling methods. Senator May argues plastic recycling methods are both ineffective and environmentally harmful.
We would all love to think that there's a simple solution. We take all the plastic, we gather it all up, we melt it down, we use it again, and, that becomes a circular system, but it doesn't work that way. The plastics that are in the materials that we buy are so different. There's thousands of different compounds that make them up, and they don't play well together. So you can't just throw them all into a pot and boil them and come up with something that's useful.
May says the PREA bill focuses on getting these plastics out of the system altogether versus trying to live with them. The Affordable Waste Reduction Act last year didn't make it out of committee in either chamber, and the PREA bill passed the Senate but didn't make it to the floor for a vote in the Assembly. Legislative sponsors of both bills plan to push for their bills to be passed before the end of session. The challenge for the PREA bill lies in the Assembly since it has passed the Senate twice. Glick says she is optimistic but has concerns the Affordable Waste Reduction Act could create confusion for members.
It's not helpful and creates unnecessary divisions of people having to choose, are you going to go with this bill or that bill and this member or that member. It helps industry to create that.
One of the key elements to the PREA bill passing seems to be timing. Each year, the PREA bill gets its closest to the Assembly floor for a vote in the last week of session in June, right at the 11th hour. Glick says this really creates problems for the bill to pass as most lawmakers are checked out and or engaged in other off-session responsibilities and events. Glick adds she is hopeful to bring her bill to the floor sooner this session, aiming for right after the budget passes. Legislative session is scheduled to wrap up around the first week of June. The final budget is due April 1st. If the budget doesn't go into overtime, that leaves lawmakers with about 6 weeks before the final stretch of session to get the PREA bill passed. Again, timing seems to be a key element here. However, lawmakers seem determined to get this bill finally passed after 2 years of near misses. We'll be keeping an eye on how all of this unfolds. Elise Klein, New York Now.
This year, Governor Kathy Hochul has proposed about $595 million for critical maintenance funding for SUNY campuses. However, the SUNY Chancellor and the Board of Trustees say that is only a small portion of the funding needed to address major infrastructure issues. The university is calling for about $10 billion over the next 5 years to make headway on these projects. We connected with SUNY Chancellor John King to discuss the funding for higher education and to get the latest update on SUNY's enrollment. Here's that conversation. Thank you so much for joining us back on the show today, Chancellor.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Of course. Now, you've just wrapped up the higher education budget hearing at the state capitol. How are you feeling about your testimony, and how do you think that it was received by lawmakers?
You know, it was a great conversation about all the good things that are happening at SUNY. Our 3 years in a row of enrollment increases across every sector for the first time since 2007, 8, 9. Our efforts to deliver on the vision of an internship for every SUNY undergraduate, the growth of research across our campuses. So lots of highlighting good things, but also an honest conversation about some of our real needs, particularly around capital, where we've got a $10 billion critical maintenance backlog across the system. And we need the help of the governor and the legislature to address that critical maintenance backlog.
And you also delivered your testimony against the backdrop of the threat of federal funding cuts to higher education. So how are you hoping that the state budget will set SUNY up for success in the long term?
We've lost $43 million in federal grants so far under the Trump administration. About $13 million of that was funding for research. So we need the state to step up and continue to invest in research, because research drives innovation. It drives improvements in healthcare. It drives the growth of industries like the semiconductor industry. About 30 million of those lost grants were student support programs. For example, the Trump administration eliminated the Hispanic Serving Institution program. They eliminated Upward Bound at SUNY Plattsburgh. And so we need the state's help to support those opportunity programs that make such a big difference in the lives of students, like our Educational Opportunity Program at SUNY, which for nearly 60 years has been an engine of social mobility for New Yorkers.
And as you mentioned, the governor's budget proposed about $595 million for critical maintenance for SUNY. Meanwhile, your office has estimated about $10 billion is needed to really address the capital needs at campuses over the next 5 years. So can you walk us through how that figure was determined, and tell us more about how your office is going to be working with both the executive chamber and the legislature to raise that threshold for funding?
Sure. Look, many of our buildings across the 64 SUNY campuses were built in the 60s and 70s. And one of our challenges is that if those buildings haven't had major renovations, they're desperately in need of them. Some examples: at Buffalo State in the fall, we had a dorm that didn't have hot water because of the pipe system. Students had to shower in trailers. At SUNY Purchase a couple weeks ago, amidst this recent cold spell, they had to close academic buildings that didn't have heat and do class online. So these are real-world consequences of this critical maintenance backlog. What the SUNY Board of Trustees has asked for is to move that number up from $595 million to $1 billion this year for critical maintenance, and to put in place a 5-year capital plan for SUNY. We used to have that before the 2008 financial crisis. We need to get back to that. That's what the MTA has, what the Department of Transportation has. It would allow us to do more strategic planning for the capital investment.
And how will the capital funding be allocated to the respective SUNY campuses? I'm sure, as you mentioned, different campuses have differing needs and unique needs across the board. So how will the money be distributed in a way that is the most equitable and effective?
When it comes to critical maintenance, it's really triage. I mean, we're identifying which are the buildings that are most at risk. Where do we need to repair a roof? Where do we need to repair an HVAC system? And so we have a rubric that we use, buildings that are in more dire condition, where we can begin construction more quickly. We start with those. And so that's from a critical maintenance perspective. We also hope for funding for research capital. Those are dollars that are focused on building state-of-the-art labs so that we can attract federal research dollars, so that we can attract the best faculty in the world to come to our campuses to drive innovation in our economy, whether it's quantum at Stony Brook or battery technology at Binghamton or artificial intelligence at UB. Our campuses are leading the way, but we need capital investment to make sure we have those best possible facilities.
And the executive budget also included about $100 million in operating aid for SUNY downstate. Is that figure sufficient given the financial woes of the hospital being a really point of contention in recent years?
We do think that that's the right amount for this year. You'll recall that the governor committed to a $1.1 billion hospital modernization project at Downstate, which is a vital institution for Central Brooklyn and is the medical school that prepares the largest number of doctors in New York City. That $1.1 billion will allow us to renovate the existing building and build a new annex to provide ambulatory surgery and special services in oncology and cardiology. So that project will take another 7 years or so. Between now and then, we need the state's help to maintain the financial stability of Downstate. And once that project is completed, we think those renovated facilities will help us get to at least much closer to financial balance. Now, of course, all of that is happening amidst this cloud of federal cuts to Medicaid, and we don't yet know what the implications of that will be, but that's something we've got to watch closely.
And is there anything else that the governor did not include in her initial executive budget proposal that you're hoping will be included in the final enacted budget later this spring?
Two things that we talked about yesterday in the hearing. Governor's been a tremendous supporter of community colleges and has this program called SUNY Reconnect, which provides free community college for adults 25 to 55 in high demand workforce areas, advanced manufacturing, green jobs, healthcare, cybersecurity, and IT. She proposed in her budget expanding that program to emergency management, logistics, air traffic control. She proposed making it easier for students who already have a degree to come back to school for a nursing degree. That's great. We're very excited about that. But our campuses need operating support as well so that they can grow these high demand programs. And for the last 2 years, we've got $8 million each year in additional operating support that helped us add slots in programs like nursing. We were hopeful that we'd get that $8 million again. It was not included in the executive budget, but we're hoping that the governor and legislature will include that in the enacted budget. The other area we're focused on is our Educational Opportunity Program, which has grown significantly. This is a program supporting, again, very low-income New Yorkers, helping them succeed in college. That program has a great track record. We've grown enrollment in that program by 21% over the last 3 years, but our state support has only gone up 3%. So we need the state's help. Our Board of Trustees had asked for a $17 million additional investment in the EOP program, again, because it's an engine of opportunity for the state of New York.
And switching gears a bit, your office just released its latest enrollment and financial sustainability report. So how are things actively progressing with SUNY? Can you take us through some of the highlights of that report?
Yeah, the great news is because enrollment is up for 3 years in a row across every sector, we're heading in the right direction on enrollment. Because Governor Holcomb and the legislature have been so supportive, our finances are very stable. We have a small number of campuses that have had very large enrollment losses before this recent rebound. We've been working with those campuses to stabilize their finances. And what we've seen is through the hard work of the faculty, staff, and leadership on those campuses, they are getting to stability. So SUNY Maritime and SUNY Delhi are now in the black, whereas they were in financial trouble 3 years ago. Potsdam, Fredonia, and Buffalo State are all working through financial stability plans that will have them in balance within the next few years. So we're feeling very good about our overall trajectory. To maintain that trajectory, though, we need the state's continued support, particularly operating aid that helps us cover well-deserved raises for our employees.
And lastly, with SUNY being on the move, what does the next phase of advancement look like heading into the next few years?
You know, we want to continue to work to support student success. Our goal of an internship for every SUNY undergraduate is really important to set students up for economic success when they leave us. We're at about 62% of our SUNY students today have that kind of internship or experiential learning opportunity. So we have work to do to get to 100%. We want to continue to make sure we're preparing the citizens of tomorrow. We have a great program called the Empire State Service Corps, where 500 SUNY students do 300 hours a year of paid public service work. The governor has proposed doubling that program because we've had so much demand. We've had more than 4 applicants for every space in that program.
Well, that is all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Chancellor.
Thank you.
And we were speaking with SUNY Chancellor John King. Well, that does it for this edition of New York Now. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET,